Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, Stephen Burkis and all participants here. Thank you very much for spending your value time to join the webinar on the reworking stone, reworking value, craft production, material reuse, and changing well in the late Angkor period. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Darat. I graduated from Royal University of Fine Art in Phnom Penh. Then I got master degree from Kyoto University in Japan in 2010 and doctoral degree from Osaka Otani University in 2010. I have been worked at Apsara Authority from 2000 to 2021 and then moved to National Authority for Bravery in 2021. I work mainly on the Khmer ceramic in Angkor period from approximately 9 to 15th century. Today, this webinar is supported by CKS. So CKS is an independent research center that promote research, teaching, and public service in social science, art, and humanity in Cambodia and Mekong region. So today, I would like to invite Dr. Stephen Burkis to make a presentation, and he will introduce himself. For the Q&A, we can do in chat at the end of the presentation. So please, Dr. Stephen Burkis, introduce yourself and make your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, or good evening, as it is for me. I think that this is the first webinar in this year's Center for Khmer Studies series, so it's a pleasure to welcome you all and to thank the Center for inviting me and supporting this research. So this presentation is part of a larger collaborative project, and I'm speaking today as one member of a team. My earlier training and research were grounded in the archaeology of the New World, but over the past several years, I've been working more intensively in Cambodia and engaging deeply with the archaeology of Cambodia and Southeast Asia. That comparative background has shaped some of the questions that I've read in this material. Just to briefly introduce myself, I finished my PhD at the University of Toronto in 2022. Taught for 2 years in the United States and have since been working as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Warsaw. Soon I am going to begin a new position as as an assistant professor at Pontificia Universidad Católica de Peru. So I'm going to begin the presentation. I really welcome your thoughts and discussion afterward. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to share this ongoing work with you. But before getting started, I'd like to offer acknowledgements to a number of individuals and organizations that have contributed to this project since its inception in 2019. Particularly, we would like to thank the Apsara Authority for its support and participation in this research. They've really done an incredible job helping us and moving this project forward. None of this would be at all possible without them. Their insights are incredibly valuable to us also. I'd also like to specifically thank Dr. Andrew Harris, who directs the Angkor Vihara Project, and to credit him with much of the work presented in this presentation, except for any errors or mistakes that I made, which are entirely my own. But I should also emphasize that our insights and interpretations have really developed through conversations with an international team of researchers, including archaeologists from Cambodia, the United Kingdom, Japan, the US, Canada, Peru, Australia, and several other countries. So today I'll begin by introducing the Angkor Vihara Project, which is an archaeological collaboration between Apsara in Cambodia and the University of Toronto officially. Our research focuses on the late Angkorian period, from the 13th to 15th centuries, a time marked by the rise of Theravada Buddhism and major transformations in Angkor's religious landscape. A central focus of our work is the so-called Buddhist terraces, or Vihara, where Angkor Vihara Project conducted fieldwork between 2017 and 2025. For this reason, we've adopted a comparative perspective. We examined patterns of demographic and economic decline, urban decentralization, and shifts in religious geography, drawing parallels with the modern example of Detroit, Michigan, states. We chose this comparison because not only because we think it's apt, but also because I've conducted ethnographic research into Catholic communities in the city of Detroit and noted striking parallels in how religious geography shifted over time. In terms of the present fieldwork, I want to focus on the clearance of Buddhist terrace sites, or I want to review the clearance of Buddhist terrace sites, and then focus on site ATV 28 from this year and excavation results from AT 27 during the 2022 and 2025 seasons. Both sites represent Buddhist terraces, or vihara, with evidence from late occupation. But excavations at ATV 27 hinted at the presence of a sculptural workshop, a relative rarity in Angkor. After presenting the results of last year's excavations, I'll contextualize our results in regard to other sculptural workshops at Angkor, and discuss some of the similarities and differences, and offering our perspective on what this means. And finally, I'll present some of our preliminary conclusions about our findings and outline directions for future research. The Angkor Vihara Project is an international collaborative initiative directed by Dr. Andrew Harris. It began in 2017 and 2018 with Dr. Harris conducting systematic field surveys in Angkor Thom and Central Angkor. In 2019, we began to carry out clearance and mapping of 8 sites within Angkor Thom, along with initial test pit excavations to assess archaeological potential. Fieldworks expanded significantly in 2022 and thereafter, with excavations conducted across 4 sites in Angkor Thom, including ATV 27. That season also began excavations at a monumental site, ATV 009, which lies close to the biome. And we've continued focusing on ATV 009 in 2024 and in this past year as well. I'm not going to focus on the excavation results from ATV 009 during this presentation. I'll be focusing primarily on ATV 27, where I was working. So for students and non-specialists, I'll offer a brief discussion of Angkor to highlight some of the themes critical to our project. So as many of you know, Angkor was not a city in the conventional densely nucleated sense. Instead, it formed an expansive, low-density urban landscape extending from the Kulin Massif in the north to the Tonle Sap in the south. Settlement was organized through dispersed but interconnected nodes, including temple complexes, shrines, reservoirs, ponds, and residential compounds, embedded within agricultural land and crop production areas. These civic ceremonial centers were tied ideologically and administratively to the royal court and the Temple Mountain at the political court. By the late Angkorian period, this landscape was already undergoing significant transformation. Within Angkor Thom, the walled royal city established in the late 12th century by Jayavarman VII, we see evidence for continued occupation, reconfiguration of sacred space, and the proliferation of Theravada Buddhist-oriented religious sites. Our excavations at ATV 27 are situated within this context. And rather than viewing Angkor Thom solely as the creation of Jayavarman VII, for our research, it's useful to approach it as a layered urban landscape, one that both consolidated earlier political infrastructure and provided the framework for subsequent religious change. The late 12th century enclosure of Angkor Thom formalized space at unprecedented scale with a rectilinear moated citadel approximately 3 kilometers on each side, with axial roads anchored by its center at the biome. The city materialized cosmology through architecture. Yet Angkor Thom also absorbed earlier institutions, including the royal palace and the Baphuon temple mount. In this sense, it was less of a replacement than a rearticulation of political and sacred space. By the 14th and 15th centuries, that monumental core was again being reinterpreted. The large-scale Mahayana state temple framework did not disappear, but its spaces were increasingly adapted to Theravada practice. And smaller monastic installations, vihara structures, and so-called Buddhist terraces emerged within and alongside earlier monumental complexes. ATV 27 represents one such intervention. Its placement within Angkor Thom allows us to examine how inherited imperial architectures was reoccupied, modified, and localized, thus offering insights into processes of urban decentralization and religious transformation occurring within the former royal center. High-resolution mapping and excavation of paleoenvironmental data have increasingly shifted the way we think about Angkor's so-called decline. Rather than the sudden collapse, what emerges is a prolonged process of spatial reorganization between the 13th and 15th centuries. Following the death of Jayavarman VII, we see signs of political instability and ideological contestation. Possible iconoclasm targeting Mahayana Buddhist imagery, particularly images associated with Jayavarman VII's reign, suggests not simply religious change, but a renegotiation of authority and how it was embedded in material space. Importantly, monumental construction in central Angkor effectively ceases after the construction of Angkor Thom. No new civic ceremonial centers are founded there after the Mangalartha, which is dedicated in 1295 CE. The architectural grammar of state monumentalism contracts. At the same time, environmental data indicates increasing stress on Angkor's hydraulics framework, which really would have required constant maintenance given its size. When we map these trends spatially, we see fragmentation in infrastructure networks that once integrated into the landscape. Archaeologically, upper occupation layers across Angkor show reduced artifact densities and signs of diminished maintenance. This suggests not disappearance, but demographic thinking and infrastructural retrenchment. The expansive low-density agrarian web that characterized Angkor gradually tightened, with occupation concentrating in more defensible or symbolically charged or economically accessible spaces, Angkor Thom being an important place among them. From a spatial perspective, the 14th and 15th centuries represent a phase of contraction and recentering. Authority, population, and ritual practice didn't vanish, but they reorganized within this inherited monumental framework. Amid the political and infrastructural reconfiguration of the 13th and 14th centuries, we also see the consolidation of Theravada Buddhism across the Angkor landscape. Rather than treating this as just a replacement of earlier traditions, it's more productive, we think, to see Theravada as part of a broader regional religious network. Rooted in Pali scholastic traditions associated with Sri Lanka's Mahavihara lineage, this form of Buddhism circulated through mainland Southeast Asia via interconnected colonies, and by the late 13th century had become firmly embedded within the religious ecology of the region. Textual testimony aligns with the correct. Chinese envoy Zhou Deguan visited Angkor Thom in 1296. He described saffron-robed monks, pagodas housing Buddhist images, and court-sponsored Buddhist ritual. His accounts suggest that Theravada institutions weren't peripheral at this time, but integrated into both urban life and kingship. The king he encountered, often identified as Indravarman III, is often interpreted as an early Theravada monarch. From the spatial perspective, what changes in this period is not just doctrine, but the scale and distribution of sacred practice. Theravada institutions tend to be smaller, monastic, and community-oriented. They operate within and often repurpose the monumental landscapes inherited from earlier Mahayana Buddhist and Brahmanic state. The Vihara installations we excavate are material expressions of shift. By the mid-14th century, elite Hindu kingship appears to have receded. Though inscriptions are sparse at this time, later chroniclers have to be treated cautiously as to the claims. What the archaeological record makes clear, though, is continuity. Theravada monastic communities persisted within Angkor. until a very late date. In other words, while political centrality shifted, and economic as well, sacred occupation didn't disappear. The monumental floor became a monastic landscape. Sites such as ATB 27 allow us to examine this transition groundwork by looking at the vihara. So the vihara is the primary mechanism for the consolidation of Theravada practice at late Angkor. These complexes house the sangha, the monastic communities. And the vihara were not state temples in the earlier Angkorian sense. Rather, they functioned as localized ritual spaces for ordination, instruction, and communal worship embedded within village-scale environments. Archaeologically, what we often encounter are the durable substructures of these institutions, what have been conventionally termed Buddhist terraces. So the upper superstructure of the vihara is usually constructed out of wood, while the bases, the foundations, are often constructed with brick, laterite, or even sometimes sandstone. So the wood obviously doesn't survive in the Angkorian environment, whereas the foundations do. There are often also a number of ritual features that continue to survive, such as the Western pedestal, or the balang, which once would have supported a principal Buddha image or a cluster of Buddha images. And the organization of the vihara establishes a really clear ritual geometry with very consistent movements, sight lines, and spatial hierarchies condensed into this architectural form. And one of the main material markers that we find besides the foundations are all roof tiles, which aligns with Zhou Duguan's observation that buildings with tiled roofs are restricted to elite royal religious contexts. The most diagnostic archaeological remains, though, are sima stones, which are boundary markers delineating the area consecrated for monastic ordination. These are often the most visible indicators of a vihara complex within Angkor Thom. So Dr. Harris began his prospection for Buddhist terrace sites in Angkor Thom in 2017. Following the completion of a survey and the establishment of initial work sites, we launched a sustained excavation campaign in 2019 in collaboration with APSR. Fieldwork continued through the 2022 through 2025 seasons, with a long break for the pandemic. Over this period, we excavated more than 50 trenches and test pits across 7 Buddhist terraces within Angkor Thom. In addition, we cleared and documented 4 additional sites, often incorporating sediment cores to assess buried architectural and occupational layers. So logistical constraints have limited much of our work to areas accessible from the main road network until now. But the selected sites were distributed across multiple sectors within Angkor Thom. And this has allowed us to compare terrace installations in different spatial contexts within Angkor, rather than focusing on a single localized cluster. Just to briefly review the fieldwork. Our 2009 fieldwork began with the clearing of 8 Buddhist terrace sites and subsequent excavation of 8 test pits at 4 of these sites. The test pits we excavated examined the archaeology and specific above-ground features that Andrew had documented in the survey. So the balang, the altar, the sima stones, staircases, architectural junctures, votive offerings, reliquaries. It would inform us more about where to conduct larger excavations in later seasons. In 2022, we expanded on some of these trenches, although we were looking at similar contents. In 2022 through 2025, we began to expand our excavations. And in 2023, we began to focus entirely on ATB 009, a monumental Buddhist terrace, approximately 230 meters from the vine. This vihara comprises 2 main architectural segments. The first is cross-shaped or cruciform terrace, which doesn't have any superstructural features that we've documented so far, and appears to constitute some form of reappropriation or reuse of an earlier structure. The second is a lateral terrace that more closely resembles the sort of normative architecture of vihara, of Buddhist terraces that we see through Angkor Thom. and elsewhere into the present day. It's clearly incorporating multiple construction phases, marked by various junctures in the terrace's retaining wall. And the complex also includes multiple funerary and reliquary structures. The project completed excavations at ATV 009 last year in 2025. I'm not going to focus on this site today or the supplementary excavations clearance from 2023 or 2024 at other sites. I'll leave those to Andrew and Mariko and Francesca to present. I'm also not going to focus on some of our infrastructural feature investigations along the Skin Road. Instead, what I want to do, I'll give a overall synthesis of our findings from these excavations. So our excavation evidence suggests that the construction of Theravada Vihara within Angkor Thom begins as early as the 13th century, with occupation persisting into the 15th century and probably beyond. These weren't short-lived interventions, but enduring religious installations embedded within the imperial core. Stratigraphically, we see multiple phases of occupation and renovation. Floors are resurfaced, platforms are expanded or modified, the lag pedestals are rebuilt. Boundary markers are reset. These aren't static foundations, but continual engagement by successive monastic communities. And importantly, these Theravada structures don't just overwrite or erase earlier sacred landscapes. They actively engage them. Architecturally and spatially, Vihara installations are semiotic, aesthetic, and architectural grammars of earlier Brahmanic Mahayana monuments, particularly in the 13th and 14th century. Orientation, axiality, elevation, and enclosure all resonate with Angkor's long-standing architectural vocabulary, even as scale and institutional emphasis shift. A material culture reinforces this interpretation. Across multiple terrace sites, including ATV 27, we recover high densities of Chinese trade ceramics. At the same time, later construction phases reveal extensive reuse of architectural materials, repurposed, decorated into the foundations. Laterite elements are reconfigured. And this recycling isn't just expedient, it reflects a practical adaptation and a conscious engagement with monumental residue of their Angkor. So we see continuity rather than rupture, basically. And one of our key earlier findings was the establishment of a preliminary radiocarbon sequence for Buddhist terrace construction within Angkor Thom. So we have samples from multiple sites now that suggest sustained occupation and activity during the 13th through 15th century. These are contemporary with the conversion of West Cross up top and precede earlier 15th century transformation of the Baphuan into a refining Buddha. So Buddhist terrace foundations appear as part of an early wave of religious reorganization within the royal core. Importantly, we find no radiocarbon evidence linking the construction of Priya Vihar to 16th century activity, Theravada activity at Angkor Vihara. And we've also begun to establish a ceramic record within Angkor Thom, which hasn't been widely studied outside the royal palace. This is mostly earthenware vessels, typically cookingware, brown glazed stoneware from later ceramic production, green glazeware, which is earlier, made in Angkor of earthenware and occasionally glazed stoneware. But we also find a significant number of Chinese trade ceramics, which were imported en masse into Cambodia by the 11th and 12th centuries. We've also focused heavily on reliquaries and the conversion of reliquaries to earlier books. So rather than rejecting earlier monuments, Theravada communities often incorporated them, frequently using pre-existing temples into reliquary shrines, sometimes with dedicatory inscriptions. So earlier monuments were not just treated as obsolete political symbols, but as enduring vessels of ancestral presence in the landscape. However, conversion frequently involved new architectural additions, the construction of a Buddhist terrace adjacent to or integrated with the road shrine. This is a very long slide, so we'll skip some. So our earlier excavations also revealed clear evidence of architectural renovation and expansion. These phases are often visible in the stratigraphy. So we see vertical construction joins, shift in masonry technique, and changes in building material as one ascends through the foundation works. So these monuments evolved incrementally, reflecting continued investment and reinvestment over time. And one of the most striking patterns is the repeated expansion of terraces using fired brick. Brick lead Angkorian monumental architecture after the 11th century. The renewed use of brick appears to be adaptation. Fired brick could be produced locally and then in a period marked by infrastructural strain and demographic contraction, brick offered a flexible and efficient building medium. So Buddhist terrace construction also makes extensive use of recycled materials. This reflects broader changes during the 13th to 15th century when disruptions to Angkor's hydraulic system likely hindered the transport of new sandstone from quarries in the 𝐿 Hills. So to think comparatively about Angkor's spatial reconfiguration, I'm going to turn briefly to a very different case, Detroit. So in the early to mid-20th century, Detroit was one of the principal industrial centers of the U.S. Its automated and defensive industries structured not only its economy, but its demographic growth, urban expansion, and architectural investment. The city's built environment, factories, neighborhoods, schools, churches, materialized that period of industrial centrality. But beginning in the mid-20th century, industrial decentralization, suburbanization, racial segregation, and economic restructuring gradually hollowed out the urban core. Population declined dramatically. In 2019 and 2020, I conducted ethnographic research on the changing role of Catholic religious spaces within this shifting urban landscape. Although Detroit has not historically been identified as a Catholic city the same way Boston or Chicago has, Catholic immigrants formed a substantial proportion of the industrial workforce, and parish churches became the nuclei of neighborhood life. If we map parish distribution at the city's demographic height, we see a checkerboard territoriality that looks a lot like how we imagine the different vihara functioning within Angkor Thom. And the parish wasn't just a liturgical space. They served as schools, meeting halls, social centers, an anchor for community life, functioning much as we believe the vihara would function before. And as Detroit's population declined and neighborhoods thinned, parish churches became unsustainable. Authorities consolidated, closed, or merged churches. Buildings designed for thousands, dozens, or were simply abandoned. But what's really striking with research is not just the closure of a lot of churches, but adaptation. So in our fieldwork, we identified certain patterns related to the abandonment or revival of church buildings. Churches along main boulevards, thoroughfares, tended to survive, as did churches that identified strategies to extend their networks beyond their original parishes. For instance, a small number of Black churches drew African Americans through the city. Other churches became centers of Mexican culture or advocated for the rights of immigrants. Some drew on exceptional or aesthetic value from churches from other parishes, and others linked into national far-right networks or networks of green environmentalist politics, no longer serving the center of a bounded community, but as part of a node within a larger network. So based on research from Angkor Thom from 2017 to 2024, we hypothesized that a similar pattern might characterize vihara and their persistence or abandonment in later periods. I'm going to skip over that slide because I want to get to the actual research from something. So to expand and bring these themes back to Angkor, I'll be focusing on a site complex that includes twin vihara positioned on either side of a trepied or reservoir, a spatial arrangement that immediately suggests intentional planning around water. We first excavated at ATV 27 in 2022, producing evidence suggestive of a possible sculptural workshop. Our clearance also revealed an unusual water feature located between the Vihara and Eastern Road. Our recent work expanded on that early research, and at ATV 28, we conducted clearance mapping and sediment coring to better understand site organization and subsurface features. At ATV 27, we carried out excavation, quite extensive excavations this year, focusing primarily on the sandstone alignment that we believe to represent a possible workshop. Taken together, this work allows us to ask a question: what kinds of strategic adaptations and spatial transformations can be identified as complex, particularly during the Fairleigh period? So ATV 28 and ATV 27, along with ATV 30, comprise a cluster of 3 potentially interconnected vihara within a 200-meter radius of Trapeang-Long-Daray. The French refer to these vihara collectively as Group 5, but we call it the Trapeang-Long-Daray group. And these sites, along with ATV 9, have been documented since the early 20th century and were included in publications by AFAO Director Henri Marchal as early as 1918. Despite this long-standing recognition, the archaeological focus on calligraphy, temple preservation, has meant that no systematic excavations have been conducted at any of these sites until this project. ATV 28 is a central monument of Group 5 that sits directly against Trapeang-Long-Daray. Unlike most Buddhist terraces, it faces north. It's constructed as atop a substantial 4-meter higher mountain. The mount itself appears to be largely artificial, likely built from the fill derived from the adjacent pond. This elevated platform created monumentality through topography rather than through large-scale masonry construction. Access was formalized through a northern depression that likely supported a wooden staircase or ramp. Coring confirmed that there was no masonry substructure. The eastern side slopes gently towards the water, suggesting a deliberate spatial relationship between terrace and reservoir. Material reuse is extensive. Folded sandstone blocks, numerous displaced pedestals, including one with a lingam socket, and irregular clusters of recycled sima all point to adaptive construction practices. The large southern belang and possible circumambulatory space reinforce the terrace's theravada function. Stratigraphically, the mound overlays earlier occupation layers, showing that this was not a blank space, but a reworking of an existing landscape. Our second site at which we worked much more extensively is ATV 27, which is substantially larger and comprises a multi-structure monastic complex with semi-exposed vihara foundations, the foundations of a large reliquary monument, and 3 piles of blocks that we believe were smaller funerary monuments, along with a 13-meter long line of sandstone blocks, which were originally of unknown function. So the whole of ATV 27 sits within a walled enclosure and backs directly onto Trapeang-Long-Daray. We began excavating the site in 2022, so I'll briefly review those findings to help contextualize the data this year. Our first trench from 2022 investigated the sima stones at the southeastern part of the site, hoping to find a dedicatory fragment. However, natural disturbances, probably by tree roots, seem to have pushed that deposit beyond the trench profiles. We excavated the second trench along the eastern wall of one of the smaller laterite mounds that we believe to have been a chedi or stupa. This was the second of 3 hypothesized stupas. However, we collected really very little diagnostic information in this trench, aside from a possible crucible hinting at craft production consent, which is going to be important in a bit. Both of these trenches do become important, including the observation that there is potential later activity in the form of burial rates interacting with the site. The excavation of ATV 4000 confirmed that a low single-core sandstone wall, probably a terrace foundation or containing feature built of recycled sandstone blocks, divided the exterior and interior areas, with most of the artifacts concentrated south of the wall. Evidence of roof collapse included abundant roof tiles, while the absence of a brick floor suggests a wooden or rammed earth surface rather than a monumental brick pavement. And we found a lot of culturally significant finds in here, large quantities of Chinese import wares, celadon, Qingbai, Southern Song period material, along with Khmer cooking wares and glazed stonewares. and along with a silver earring, which is quite an important find because it indicates high status activity with personal adornments made of luxury materials. However, the most important trench to proceed the discussion for this year is ATD 3000, which was excavated originally by Dave Brothers. This trench targeted the junction between a large chetty structure, a reliquary, and a linear alignment of sandstone blocks extending outwards from it. And prior to excavation, the nature of this line was uncertain. Could have represented debris, a boundary feature, some sort of foundational architectural element. Because the blocks were clearly not randomly deposited, they were situated in a long line, a 13-meter long line. But as we were excavating them, we found fragments of sculptural work, including an incomplete standing Buddha figure. So this immediately shifted our interpretation. This sandstone alignment was not structural or accidental. We hypothesized that it represented a deposit of salvaged architectural blocks, sandstone blocks, that were being reused to produce sculptures. So in 2025, we expanded on Trench 3000, excavating a 13-meter by 3.5-meter area, extending southward from that large chetty foundation to a small mound associated with a downward slope into an area of lower elevation, potentially associated with looting activity. So this trench included the entire alignment of sandstone blocks. We also planned a smaller trench extending eastward from the chetty to investigate a possible staircase identified by Marshall. And we did notice a scatter of sandstone blocks to the west of the chetty, but we didn't excavate in that area due to time constraints and constraints on our resources. Also, these blocks to the west did not rest in any sort of recognizable pattern like those to the south. So in the main trench, we excavated to a level of approximately a half-meter below the surface, to a level associated with a shift in the stratigraphy and the discovery of several notable artifacts. Also to the surface, just beneath the bottoms of most of the sandstone blocks. And we were able to ascertain that the sandstone alignment definitely was not an architectural function. The blocks within the main trench sit at slightly different elevations. Some are laid east to west, others north to south. Ends don't align. We noted significant gaps between many of them. And in some cases, the second course of stones sits on top of the first. Surprisingly, we also noted the tops of four additional sandstone blocks at the elevation where we terminated the excavation. So we decided to excavate 3 sub-trenches, partly to investigate whether these blocks might pertain to an architectural function. They did not. Each block sat largely isolated. So that began to present its own puzzle. But along with the Buddha in the Abhaya Mundra pose from 2022, we identified another Buddha in Parinivrana pose. And this latter discovery was quite exciting. We encountered the lower part in the trench associated with the occupation surface and noted probable carving on the surface facing downwards. And we flipped the stone, but we couldn't tell what the sculpture represented, with our colleague Rachna suggesting that it might be a lintel. And later I decided to expand the excavation slightly to the west to expose another stone block that looked like a sculptural fragment facing downwards. We flipped it, and Andrew realized that the 2 fragments fit together. And as we pushed them together, Rachna shouted, "Lying Buddha!" And it was very exciting. But I'm also highlighting the fact that we actually encountered the fragment with the head of the Buddha exposed on the contemporary ground surface. And this will become important later. To the north, near the chetty, we identified several blocks that appeared to be in the process of material subtraction. Most had not yet reached the stage where an image could be easily identified. One may correspond to an unfinished Naga or a Naga Buddha. The curved shape that you see here on the block on the top right, we think might represent a hood. And you can note the ridged features along the edge of the block. We're in the process of modeling these in 3D to see if we can gain any additional insights. But excavations associated with unfinished sculptures also show what appears to be a occupation surface, collected with bits of carbon, copper mule, iron slag, and some strange modeling with a whitish gray clay-like substance, which maybe someone else has encountered and can tell us what it might be. We only encountered this modeling in the northern area near the Chetty, where we believe the carving was actually happening. We also noticed this probable unfinished bourne in that area with a seated Buddha. We can't definitively explain the abandonment of most of the unfinished sculptures at ATV 27, but this abandonment presents less of a mystery because the sandstone block cracked in half and the other side fell away to the east. You can't see it in this picture. I haven't shown it in this image, but it may not have left sufficient raw material to complete the whole sculpture. We also recovered two sculptural fragments, neither of which appear to have reached the polishing stage. Both likely pertain to the legs of a seated Buddha, but conform to different dimensions. So in total, we can identify at least 6 incomplete statues associated with the workshop area. And of these, at least 5, probably all 6, represent an image of the Buddha across a variety of poses. To the south of the area associated with these carved blocks, we also noted relatively dense sandstone debitage, so shatter from the carving process. In many cases, we could see visible hammer marks and sharp edges where it had flaked off the larger blocks. We noticed the highest concentrations just to the south of the area with the carved blocks, with lower concentrations further to the south of the trench. In the southern part of the trench, we actually noted no sandstone debitage at all. We think that additional debitage might have been deposited into the nearby pond, which is only a few meters to the west. But very high water this October and November prevented us from making any real effort to identify deposits like that. And finally, we also noted 2 blocks with Khmer numerals inscribed into them. One of these was in the southern portion of the alignment, while the other was that western scatter of sandstone blocks. The character seems to be the same on both blocks and may represent a 1 or possibly a 6. We hypothesize that these numbers may relate to assembly or disassembly of a sandstone structure or possibly to the statue production, but we can't really tell what period the actual carving dates to. So perhaps someone in the audience can tell us, has a better idea about this. I've seen this feature in specific periods. So the debitage and the unfinished Buddha confirm that the area to the south of the Chetty, the reliquary, functioned as a sculptural workshop. And as far as we can tell, the first of its kind associated with the carve, because it's not linked with any major global monument. What's especially striking is the chain abattoir running south to north along the trench. So they seem to be moving blocks from the southern end through different stages of carving and surface finishing towards the northern end. And unlike the better known bronze and stone workshop or palace, this workshop seems to be a later date. So combined with the Theravada Buddhist iconography, the evidence suggests that the statue production in this period had become increasingly decentralized and locally organized, taking place across multiple vihara sites. The raw material is almost entirely recycled stone, and it's quite possible that some of it was quarried directly from the original superstructure of the Chetty, which I'll get to in a moment. So in the same context, we also encountered a significant concentration of iron slag. So this was near the southern end of the trench, away from the carving area, near the western profile, associated with the occupation surface, also with a very deep charcoal lens, a mostly intact Khmer brownware vessel, and the smaller sculptural fragment of the Buddha. So we'll be probably able to date this. And the slag, which there's a significant quantity. This is only a single bag of it that we collected. Suggests metallurgical activity, as does the crucible encountered in Trench 2000 in 2022. So there's a really sort of substantial phase of craft or industrial activity here. And we sampled the charcoal, so that should help clarify the chronology. We also recovered copper mule from closer to the 𝐀𝐻 in the area associated with statue production. And we found this associated with the occupation surface and a less concentrated charcoal base. So we want to take special note of the iron and copper because at the Royal Palace, we can also link those with sculptural production, albeit in different phases. 𝐀𝐭 and his colleagues uncovered substantial evidence for organized statuary production in the Royal Palace precinct of Angkor Thom, confirming the existence of sandstone sculpture workshop north of the palace enclosure. The site contained multiple unfinished sandstone figures, including standing male and female divinities, a large Vishnu image, and enormous unfinished pedestal, which suggests in situ carving. Later excavations definitively confirmed a dedicated sandstone workshop phase with high densities of sandstone debitage, sandstone shatter coming from statue carving, dating stylistically to the 12th century. One sculpture over 1.5 meters tall was roughed out for a standing Vishnu. Another fragment showed a clearly outlined sampot and a decorative belt. So surface survey also identified 10 additional unfinished sandstone sculptures with large quantities of carving waste, and stratigraphic evidence shows that sandstone production began after the leveling and abandonment of the metallurgical workshop in the early 12th century. The workshop area there, though, is very large, covering at least 2,000 meters square and possibly extending further. But what's really interesting is evidence also suggests that some unfinished statues remain visible and culturally significant long after production ceased, as they're found positioned above the workshop layers. And so these may have retained meaning for later inhabitants, perhaps even into the present. So 𝐀𝐭 also present comprehensive archaeological and materials-based analysis for organized sandstone production at Harihara, associated particularly with the temple of Bakal. So I'm not going to talk about as much as about the 9th century phase that they identified, but rather the 12th to 13th century phase, which is focused specifically on sculpture manufacture. So in the 12th to early 13th century, the site became an active sculpture workshop, producing freestanding images. Archaeological signatures, much like our workshop and the workshop at the Royal Palace, include piles of sandstone debitage, unfinished statues, demonstrating this staged production sequence with rough dressing of rock blocks, progressive refinement of the forms, detailed rendering of ornaments, and then polishing. So our findings at ATV 27 conform to many of the observations that 𝐀𝐭 and his colleagues made in regard to the statue workshops at Harihara and the Royal Palace. The organization of the sandstone blocks follows a staged production sequence. We also noted high concentrations of sandstone debitage, freestanding statues, and even association with probable slag iron and copper. Moreover, the upper half of the reclining Buddha sits high in the stratigraphy, actually on the contemporary occupation surface, suggesting continued veneration. The remains of a Buddha in earth witness pose also remains on the surface, though we can't definitively link that with the sculptural production. It may come from another area. We think it's most likely that it does derive from the statue production at ATV 27. And in fact, we identified no finished statues and no evidence for the final stage of polishing. So we also haven't dated this workshop phase yet, but it probably dates to significantly later, given the exclusive focus on Theravada iconography and raw material entirely recycled from nearby monuments. And also at ATV 27, statue production seemingly took place at a much smaller scale, unassociated with any major royal monument. The lack of excavation data on sculpture workshops prevents us from saying whether this was the norm or in development later periods linked to political decentralization and population decline. However, we can suggest that rather than functioning solely as liturgical centers, sites like ATV 27 could also operate, at least at certain moments, as hubs of production and industry. Please let me know if I'm starting to go over time. I have a bit more of a presentation to go through, focusing on the 𝐀𝐻 or the reliquary. So Reuse and renovation actually mark the most characteristic trends at ATV 27. Trench 3000 at the base of the Chetty identified 3 additional courses of laterite not documented in 2022. And these sit underneath a protruding layer with a notable lip, which we understandably interpreted as the base of the structure prior to excavation. The base of these bottom 3 courses sits at the same elevation as the top of a layer of thick, gray, compacted sediment that remained waterlogged at the end of the rainy season while excavating. At no point did we identify a possible builder's trench. And at the corner of the structure, I want to draw your attention to a brick protruding from between 2 courses of lateral. We noted a clear seam between the bottom 3 courses and what we would initially interpret as the base of the Chetty. So this seam had a substantial amount of rubble wedged into it, which we interpreted as a base, an attempt to level the upper courses reliquary, which suggests that the base of the Chetty actually pertained to an earlier structure, perhaps associated with all of the sandstone blocks to the south and west. Our colleague Patricia Quiñones, along with Jaime, excavated trench, who's in the audience, excavated trench 5000A at the top of the Chetty to identify any shifts in the stratigraphy. She noted 2 distinct stratigraphic levels that correspond roughly to the seam between the lower courses and the Chetty and the upper courses. And at no point did she identify a laterite or brick floor to the structure. And into the trench to the east, Dr. Francesca Monti from Quiñones identified a staircase beneath the laterite rubble, as Marchal hypothesized. However, the laterite staircase did not descend to the bottom of the lower courses of the Chetty structure. Rather, the base of the staircase sat level with the protruding course that we had initially interpreted as the base in 2022. And this strongly suggests that both the staircase and the upper courses of the Chetty represent later additions or renovations after sediment had accumulated around the early base. And in fact, the bases of the Sema stones in the eastern portion of Trench 5000 sit only slightly lower than the base of the staircase. This hints that the laterite structure might date to significantly earlier than the construction of the apartment. And as I briefly mentioned earlier, we actually identified several sandstone blocks in Trench 3000 beneath the level of occupation associated with the sandstone workshop and the Vihara. While 2 of these sat level on the ground, a third rested at an incline angled downward from south to north, looking like it was falling or something. We also encountered a small fragment of a sandstone block with a hole in it beneath the occupation surface near the Chetty itself. And all of this indicates that the scatter of sandstone blocks also pertains to an earlier occupation of the site and may in fact have composed the superstructure associated with what would become the base of the Chetty. We think it might have been possibly an earlier reliquary or a croissant. We opened 2 additional trenches at ATV 27 in 2025, and I'm going to focus on them primarily in relation to site chronology, just a brief discussion. So Trench 6000 was placed just to the north of the exposed foundation wall of Buddhist Terrace, just north of Trench 4000. So this targeted an area of fired brick that was exposed along the embankment wall enclosing the Vihara. Excavation showed in Trench 6000 that the embankment wall was stratigraphically higher than the original foundations of the Chetty. So again, this suggests that the Vihara predates whatever this laterite foundations work. Trench 7000 also clarifies this reorganization. Here, Dr. Francesca Monti was excavating the embankment of the pond. The presence of fired brick again suggests a later construction date. The embankment also sits stratigraphically higher than the foundations of the Chetty, or at least its base does. But Monti also discovered significant cultural layers associated with the embankment, which suggest domestic refuse disposal and likely habitation immediately adjacent to the previous. So people are continuing to live in this area into until quite a late date. So crucially, both the ponding method and the associated deposits, again, sit stratigraphically higher than the base of the Chetty. So there's significant quantities in this refuse associated with the embankment of imported Chinese porcelain, which joins a broader collection of high prestige objects associated with the Theravada phase of the site. A silver earring, Chinese coins, crystals, multiple fragments of Chinese celadon, blue and white ceramics, so-called mercury jars. So if Angkor in the 14th century were truly an economic freefall, we wouldn't expect to see this kind of material signature. These artifacts show access to wealth and connectivity embedded in long-distance exchange networks. And what we see at ATV 27 is, and other sites, is not isolation and impoverishment, but participation and selective concentration of resources. So as large-scale construction projects diminished, the ability to organize labor decline, wealth and exchange did not vanish from Angkor. Instead, they appear to have been redistributed into new institutional centers, monastic complexes, and community-based sacred spaces. Theravada institutions in Lake Angkor were not marginal refuges in a declining city. They were active participants in regional exchange networks and likely beneficiaries of elite and mercantile patronage. And given the historic links between Theravada and monasticism and maritime trade, its broad popularity at Angkor Thom may actually result partly from the promise of access to such portable wealth in the face of increased concentration of land and agricultural resources documented by Damian Evans and Sarah Classy. So to offer some overall conclusions from our excavations at ATV 27 this year, the sandstone alignment most likely represents a workshop dedicated to salvaging sandstone blocks from earlier monumental architecture and using these to produce images of the Buddha, perhaps to be circulated to other Vihara within the immediate vicinity. ATV 27 also represents a multi-phase site. The base of the Chetty may originally have been sought. The sandstone blocks of the site may derive from this structure. However, the association of the workshop area with the distinct stratigraphic layer suggests that it functioned after the establishment of the Vihara, though not after the abandonment of the Vihara. We await precise C14 dates confirming this. Moreover, burials associated with some of the reliquaries may date to even later phases. Point number 3, architectural salvage at ATV 27 and other sites, along with inconsistent use of building materials, shows a decline in the ability to coordinate and mobilize labor even at relatively small scales. In contrast, the portable wealth at the site indicates continued patronage by aristocrats or merchants. And to conclude with a few broad reflections. The evidence for sculptural production at ATV 27, particularly in proximity to the main arterial road within Angkor Thom, may help explain the site's persistence into very late phases of occupation. This terrace functioned not only as a ritual space, but also as a locus of image production and modification. It would have remained materially and spiritually significant within the rescaling of urban landscape. Yet the workshop evidence ultimately raises more questions than it answers in some ways. Unfinished sculptures and partially worked blocks scattered across Angkor Thom, observed in earlier prospection by Dr. Andrew Harris, suggest that ATV 27 was not unique. These fragments raise the possibility of multiple production areas operating at different scales throughout the city. And this brings us to a larger issue. The production of sacred images was not a casual act. It required specific types of stone, trained sculptors, appropriate tools, and ritual authorization. Image making was embedded within religious practice. It may even have required sacralized locations. So how decentralized was statue production in late Angkor? Did production remain concentrated near temples, or did it disperse alongside Theravada monastic expansion? Does the degree of centralization shift over time, mirroring broader patterns of political contraction, urban reorganization? Or did the sculpture, were sculptors attached permanently to particular institutions, or were they peripatetic artisans moving from terrace to terrace, establishing temporary workshops as patronage required. Answering these sorts of questions is going to require additional excavations and work at Buddhist terraces and at sculptural production sites throughout Angkor Thom. Luckily, we have a number of potential next steps planned. As you might imagine, this is only one site we've excavated over the past few years. We have an enormously rich body of data, and we can go in a number of directions. These are just a few initial thoughts about what we might undertake. And I'll finish here and open the floor for questions. And if anyone has any questions on aspects of the project that I haven't covered or can't answer, I would direct you either to the extensive publication history of the project or to Dr. Andrew Harris, who is in the audience. So, yes, happy to metaphorically pass the thing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stephen Berkeley, for making a very insightful presentation on reworking stone, reworking value, scrap production, material use, and changing value in late Angkor period. So, especially you conducted mainly on the excavation at the 1827. So, this very useful information that to show evidence of the workshop of the Buddha statue in Angkor Thom. And this is first time for me to see this kind of workshop after I saw some stone workshop at Hariharalaya that you mentioned that conducted an excavation by Martin a long time ago. So now this is new information. And along with, you also found some Chinese ceramic at the side. So now there are three questions that the attendee asked you. One question from Mr. Reworking, and two other questions from anonymous attendee. So first of all, I would like to read the question from Reworking first. He's an architect and a lecturer at the Caltech and Northern University. His question is curious whether it would be reasonable to argue that the spatial arrangement of the Angkor Vihara evolved from the early Buddhist Chaitya hall typology. What should you consider there to be a typological continuity between the two? So this is the first question. I would like to ask you to answer the first question first.
I think this question is beyond my expertise at the moment. I'm mostly focusing on the later periods at Angkor, but I think that Dr. Andrew Harris probably has a insightful opinion on this question. So I would just encourage the professor to contact Andrew, or we could pass the mic directly to Andrew, who's in the audience, if we want to do that now.
Thank you very much. Now I think you should continue to ask him personally. And I would like to move to other two questions. Yeah, Andrew put the email at the chart. Harris 22 and US, EU, Singapore. So we can ask him any question related to the presentation. So are there two questions? How would you choose the urban phenomena in Michigan as a comparison? Consider that Angkor and the US have a wide gap in terms of period, geography, cultural background, etc. Have you ever recognized smaller patterns on neighboring ancient society, for example, in the region of Southeast Asia? Thank you.
I think that's a good question. I think, well, I come from an anthropological background, and one of the things that we tend to do is we tend to look for processes that resemble each other across different cultures and across different time periods, so that we can compare and contrast them, so that we can see how human societies generally work, or how cities, so that we can make sort of larger claims about how cities work, or how religion works, or particular forms of religious geography work. So we chose Detroit specifically because I'd done work in Detroit, but also because, having done work in Detroit, I saw what seemed to be really striking parallels in terms of the religious geography. So you have both Catholic churches and Vihara as initially functioning as the centers of sort of bounded communities within a larger urban landscape, in a powerful city. So Detroit's not an imperial capital, was never an imperial capital, but it was one of the most economically important, or one of the most economically important cities in the US for 50 years. And what happens when we start to see the population moving out of Detroit following the factories is you start to see similar patterns of abandonment. And but we get to look in Detroit at one of the problems with doing ancient history, with doing archaeology, is that it can be hard to look at things happening over the course of a few years or even a couple of decades, right? Our resolution is not high enough to really understand some of the things that are feeding into these processes of what gets abandoned, why does it get abandoned, versus what persists, which vihara persists for decades, centuries. Whereas in Detroit, we can see that, because not only do we have very detailed historical records, but in a lot of cases, we can talk to people who were still alive while these things were happening. And we find similar sorts of patterns related to the sort of expense or difficulty of maintaining infrastructure in certain areas, distance from the city core, that sort of thing, but also more interesting cultural factors, like certain churches continue to be thrive because of their exceptional historic or aesthetic value. Well, we seem to see something very similar at ATV 9, right? It's a beautiful monumental Buddhist terrace near the bayou, which appears to keep functioning into a very, very late period. And even after its abandonment, we see activity with there also with later burials of urn burials. Likewise, another thing that we see in Detroit is certain churches along major thoroughfares tend to survive. So it's interesting to see whether that also holds true as a hypothesis for Vihara along the Southgate Road, for instance, that's leading from the Bayonne to Angkor Wat, or along the other roads within the city. So we want to use Detroit as a way to generate hypotheses, right? So another thing that keeps some of these churches alive is participation in these larger national networks where other sorts of political groups or religious groups or environmentalist groups are funding their activities from outside. So they start functioning in a different way compared to when they were in these centers of, ethnic Catholic parishes in the city. And we kind of see similar things involving these Chinese import ware as the other signs of wealth at ATV 27, for instance, the silver earring, the Chinese coin. Those are quite unusual things to find. They are signs of personal prestige and participation in these long distance networks. Probably with people who have already left for the Quatre Bras region, sending back wealth to patronize monasteries in Thom. Likewise, another hypothesis generated from Detroit is that certain vihara would survive because they found ways to adapt. They found new strategies, new ways of being important within this increasingly fragmented urban landscape. So ATV 27 becomes a sort of production area, circulating these Buddhist images potentially to other vihara that are still functioning within Angkor Thom. So it's also it would also be productive to compare it to other cities in Southeast Asia or other Buddhist cities, how the vihara function within those, what they're doing. But there's many different comparisons to make and many ways of drawing parallels, and they can all yield different sorts of insights, different hypotheses. So the point is not to claim that Detroit and Angkor are the same. It's to look at Detroit and think and use that as a way to think about what's happening at Angkor to sort of come up with hypotheses and ideas that can help us to interpret the archaeology.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you again. So there remains another question. Could this workshop have been involved in the production of the inscription?
Yes, but it's hard to say because there's so few inscriptions at this time period that it's difficult to trace them or understand how or where they're being produced. As far as the inscription of the Khmer numeral on the two blocks of the workshop, we don't know. We don't know if that was related to the workshop process, the sculpting process, or if it was related to the earlier construction from which they took this stone. But the main thing that we see, the only thing that we have definitively identified in terms of what the workshop is producing are images of the Buddha. We don't have any other definitive form of sculpture. We don't have any inscriptions that definitely date to this time period in the area.
Thank you. So not finished yet. There are two more questions from attendee, but no name. So now I read the question one by one. What is the best guess of the total number of vihara that were made or repurposed from previous infrastructure in Angkor Thom area? Would this number have been the main driver for the demand for the Theravada statuary?
There's a huge number of Buddhist terraces within Angkor Thom. I think there's, Andrew might correct me on this, but I believe there's 50 documented vihara, confirmed vihara within Angkor Thom, and then a number of other possible vihara. And that is certainly driving demand for Buddha images. And given that the focus is almost exclusively on Buddha images, and it would not surprise me if there were more workshops and if we found could identify significant more issues. You have to remember we did not see any of these statues really on the surface except for the Earth Witness Buddha. So this is something that we can hope to confirm in future research. As to we know that other Buddhist monuments and elements of Vihara within Angkor Thom were converted from earlier religious structures, from Mahayana or Brahmanistic structures, Brahmanical, I should say. We can't really say how many because we can only really talk about the ones that we've excavated, because those conversions don't really become clear until you start digging. I know there's evidence of this at ATV 9, ATV 27. I would have to go back and read through all of our site reports to answer for every single site that we've excavated. But 9 and 27 are the two main sites that we focused on in terms of broad scale excavations.
Adding to the question, Andrew Harry, he held to answer there are 72 total vihara in Angkor Thom identified, 13 thus far outside. So there another one question. Do you think that the traces of the metal was were from the working and reworking of chisel, and do you have evidences of tool apart from the tool mark on the stones?
I would assume that the slag metal is from making tools. It's funny that this is a funny question. Because we got really excited because we thought that we identified an iron tool in situ at the occupation level. And it turned out, I think, to be, and initially we believe it turned out to be an arrowhead once we cleaned it, an iron arrow tip, which is unusual. Maybe they were repurposing that as a tool. I don't know, but we have not found any definitive tools. We found a weapon. We actually found two weapons because we found what was clearly a slingstone ball. So why are we finding weapons in the workshop context next to a vihara? I'm not sure. But no tools, unfortunately. Not yet. Maybe if we expanded the trench outwards.
Maybe just small scale excavation, we don't find any tool evidence or tool yet, right?
So yeah, it would be interesting to go back and look for tools.
Yeah, sure. So now Andrew add more. Good article on this, on the Theravada Buddhism. You can see in Thompson in 1998 and 2004, and then Harris in 2019 and 23, and Thompson edited 2022, early Theravadin Cambodia volume. So in that volume, I also wrote about the Theravada Buddhism in Cambodia. So I also work on that. So I classify the Theravada Buddhist structure in Cambodia into two states. The first state is the appearance of the Theravada Buddhist in Angkor Thom, Angkor Wat, and in Angkor region, and also the rework of the large-scale monument from the Hindu temple to Buddhist Theravada Buddhist structure like seated Buddha on Phnom Bakheng, and reclining Buddha at the Bapuan Temple, and a stupa in Preakan, and Buddha statue at Angkor Wat. So this is the second stage of the Theravada Buddhism in my article. So I think it's interesting article, and we should read from that volume. So now we still have 8 minutes to Q&A. How how do you think the Theravada Buddhism in Cambodia? You can think it probably start in late Angkor period, from approximately late 13th century or so.
Yeah, it seems that way.
Mm.
Sometime in the 13th century, they begin to proliferate very quickly.
Yeah.
I can show the slide with the dates again. So there it is. So the sort of major wave of construction comes in the late 13th to 14th century.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. That's clear from the.
And what's interesting is, especially in this early wave, they're very clearly taking, as we said, they're constructing it in a very Khmer style. It's taking a lot of architectural and aesthetic and symbolic cues from earlier Mahayana and Brahmanic temples and structures. So we also have Andrew and I have an interesting paper coming out about this in the Cambridge Archaeological Journal. Should be published online soon, about social change and what is behind it, and why people might have begun that the shift to Theravada Buddhism was not as much of a rupture with what went before as it seems like, or as many scholars have made it out to be, that there was quite a bit of continuity in terms of how people were thinking about religion and religious spaces and religious activity.
Thank you. So now Andrew Harris would like to ask you a question. Actually, Andrew Harris, he worked in Angkor since I still working at Apsara Authority. We were very good friend and good researcher together. So he would like to ask you, can you tell us a bit more about your work in Peru and how that compare with the work you are done in Cambodia?
I would love to. Thank you. And a lot of that is, well, it follows very similar themes to what I just said. Focused on social change, understanding social change through archaeology and shifts in urban religious geography. So what is happening when we see in the archaeological record what appear to be these sort of sharp shifts from one cosmology or religion or way of thinking to another? Are they really these ruptures that we that a lot of scholars have supposed? Are they revolutions? Are they people rejecting what came before to adopt something new? And so a lot of my research has focused on that in Peru also. And in many cases, I think what the research in both Peru and in Cambodia shows is that this isn't the case. that we look back on these, the adoption of a new religion or something like that may become a turning point later. But frequently people, as they are adopting these new institutions, may not be fully rejecting the old. They may be, they're fitting the new into their previous understanding of the world and how the world works, into their sort of set of their symbolic grammars, their sort of you might so we see that in both cases. It makes a sort of interesting comparative study. But there's quite a lot of parallels. So, well, just to jump back for a moment there, one of the things I suggested towards the end of the talk was that part of the reason that people may have, that Theravada Buddhism became so popular so quickly, is that it may have offered people access to portable wealth, silver earrings, Chinese trade goods, as other forms of, as the ability to access other forms of wealth in central Angkor was declining. So they're doing that for pragmatic, strategic reasons, but because they follow the Theravada canon, because they follow the ritual, the sort of way of acting, the way of thinking, the way of reciting, this eventually sort of shapes a profound shift in how they think about themselves, how they think about the world around them. And that's something that I'm trying to understand as well. But there's all sorts of other comparisons that I like to make. So one is, one that I've started thinking about is how kingship operates in different contexts, and the way that societies might prevent kings from getting too powerful, or certain royal families from getting too powerful. And I see a potentially really useful comparison there between the Inca and Angkorian rulers that I think could be applied. So there's a lot of interesting comparisons we can make.
Thank you very much. Now it's time. Just very good time. Thank you very much for the participant who spend your valuable time to attend this webinar by Dr. Stephen Berquist, and thank also to CK for arranging this seminar.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Yeah.